This is a joint event organized by APSN, which is a collaborative scholarly initiative that supports Arab political scientists, and SEDEJ, the Center for Economic, Legal, and Social Studies and Documentation in Cairo. You can find more information about APSN and SEDEJ on their website, which will be added on the chat box. I would also like to announce that this event will be live streamed and recorded and also published on the website of both APSN and SEDEJ later on. For our audience, welcome and thank you for joining us. Throughout the event, you're welcome to add any questions that you might have in the chat box, and we will try to answer these in the Q&A session. So this event is looking at the study of the politics of infrastructure, which has become kind of a hot topic among scholars in the Middle East and North Africa, with different disciplinary and interdisciplinary backgrounds from anthropologists, historians, political scientists, geographers. And during these times of war in the region, the conversation on the politics of infrastructure is more timely than ever. And we would like to take this opportunity to also announce that this event is a plenary session that will be joined and followed by a series of seminars and talks that will take place between January and May. The program will be announced very soon, so please keep an eye on this. And if you would like more information, you can always sign up on the newsletter of APSN and SEDEJ, and you will get more information. Today's webinar will be talking more about the overarching theme of the politics of infrastructure. And we have three esteemed scholars who have been working on various aspects of the topic, and they will be sharing their expertise with us. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. First, Professor Laleh Khalili, and she's Professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter. She has numerous monographs and books. She's author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, also author of Time in the Shadows, Confinement, and in Counterinsurgencies, also author of Sinews of War and Trade. You can also look out for her forthcoming book, The Corporeal Life of Seafaring. Second, we have Dr. Dalia Wahdan. She's associate professor at the American University in Cairo. She's also co-founder of Bureau Gladys, which is a joint venture for urban and architectural studies based in Cairo. She's an anthropologist working on urbanism in India, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And she also has a book entitled Planning Egypt's New Settlements, The Politics of Spatial Inequities. Third, Dr. Akin Kurtic. She is postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University. She's sociocultural anthropologist whose work is at the intersection of environmental anthropology and history, social studies of infrastructure and technopolitics, and political ecologies. She has published on the topic many journal articles, and she also has a book manuscript in progress entitled Sedimented Landscape, Building Dams, Restoring Ecologies in the Churu Basin. Finally, myself, I'm May Darwish. I'm Associate Professor International Relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham, and I am Principal Investigator of the project on the politics of infrastructure, everyday life from the Arabian Gulf to the Horn of Africa. Without any further delay, I would like to pass on the mic to Dr. Laleh. So, Professor Laleh, so please, you're welcome to start your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the APSN and to SEDEJ for asking me to be here. And I would like, before I start, to actually declare my solidarity with Palestinians that are undergoing unspeakable violence right now. So what I want to do today in the 7 minutes or so that I've been given is to talk a little bit about transportation infrastructures and the centrality of transportation infrastructures to violence and war. We already know that transportation infrastructures, whether it is roads or more recently airports, but also throughout human history, ports and harbor infrastructures have been enormously crucial to the making of states. Actually, for a very brief moment before we all started live streaming, we had a quick little glimpse of the current head of SEDEJ Cairo's amazing book, that's Pascal Menoret, whose amazing book, Joyriding in Riyadh, actually talks about how important road building was in the mid to late 20th century in Saudi Arabia, in actually consolidating the power of both capital and the state in the city of Riyadh. But my own area of research has always been, in the last 10 or 15 years, has been on the question of maritime infrastructures. And one of the things that becomes very, very clear is that the maritime transportation infrastructures, the harbors where cargo is loaded, and the interim infrastructures for refueling and victualling, feeding ships that travel, was absolutely crucial to the work of colonialism. It was absolutely crucial to the spread of the British Empire and the other European empires throughout the countries of the tricontinent, Africa, Latin America, and in that case also the Spanish and the Portuguese as well, and of course Asia. And we know that those kinds of port and maritime infrastructures have continued to be considered kind of dual use assets. On the one hand, enormously important for commerce, but also very central as strategic assets, not only to the countries in which those transportation infrastructures are located. So, for example, the port of Jabal Ali is considered perhaps the most important port in the Middle East because of the volume of goods that go through it. So it is a strategic asset to the city-state of Dubai. It is also a strategic asset to the United Arab Emirates Confederation, but also very significantly, it is a strategic asset to the United States, which uses Jabal Ali as one of the local ports that it does for sending in troops, for extracting troops, but also for controlling and surveilling the materials that travel by ship. Okay, so we've got this kind of a dual use, this fungibility between the commercial and the strategic, the war making and the money making. And those things really can't be prized apart. Those two things function together, in part because I think the systems that sustain life today in many ways, the systems that, including, for example, maritime infrastructures, that facilitate the arrival of the kinds of goods we need to live, everything from food to the equipment that we need in order to, for example, have clean water, to the kinds of material we need in order to survive, to medications, etc. All of this is absolutely, on the one hand, crucial to our lives, but also constantly threatened by its absorption, or even worse, destruction by machineries of coercion and war. So the example that I would like to end with today, in the couple of minutes that is left to me, is that of the crucial transportation infrastructures in Palestine. We know that part of the incredible landscape of control, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza or in East Jerusalem, have been roads, for example, that are distinguished by who can travel on them, where they start and where they end, for example, or what sorts of checkpoints are placed in them, or whether or not they're bisected or nonsensically end up at some sort of a massive Great Barrier. So we know that those roads are absolutely a part of a network of control by the Israeli state, by the Israeli settler colonial state, in all of the places that it has colonized. We also know that in addition to the roads that are existing in this way, control over even the most rudimentary sea accessing, maritime access, harbors or infrastructures in Gaza, for example, are heavily delimited by the state of Israel. But even inside the Green Line, where there are, of course, a lot of the coastal towns were at one point heavily Palestinian populations, or majority Palestinian populations, but those maritime infrastructures have been massively the access of Palestinians have been massively curtailed by the securitization of those spaces. But speaking of Gaza and the ways in which these life-giving infrastructures are taken and absorbed and transformed into sort of death-dealing infrastructures, is the fact that the moment that there were reserves of gas discovered not 12 miles off the coast of Gaza, we saw the Israeli state come in and limit Palestinian access, for example, fishermen's access, but also others that sort of live by the sea and were hoping to trade by the sea. We see that access being curtailed by the state of Israel. First to 3 nautical miles, and now pretty much the state of Israel shoots at anything that moves beyond 1 nautical mile from the coast. One of the other things that we have seen, and it has been kind of a horrific experience to watch, is the extent to which we hear about sort of the attacks from the air by the Israeli state, which has been absolutely targeted towards all life-giving infrastructures. They have bombed. We know that they have bombed mosques. We know that they have bombed hospitals. We know that they have bombed schools, shelters, and of course residential units. But what is also really interesting is the extent to which we don't hear about this, except if you're looking for it, of how much the Israeli Navy is also shooting from the sea at coastal infrastructures that people in Gaza have had, whether that's harbors where fishing boats are sheltering, or coastal infrastructures such as, for example, leisure areas, restaurants, cafes, things like that, or schools and other kinds of bodies that are located on those coastal areas. What that means is that land and the sea are constantly under assault. And we, of course, also know that Gaza used to have an airport, which the Israelis bombed in 2002 and shut it down, the Yasser Arafat National Airport. And this was long before Hamas came to power. Also, I think this is really important to mention. And I think part of this, and this is the last sentence with which I want to end, is that life-giving infrastructures, transport infrastructures are life-giving, life-facilitating infrastructures. But they are also incredibly crucial for the control of spaces and for states, and in this case, colonial states, for the control of the populations that live under those spaces. And when wars happen, if you either control those life-giving infrastructures or you destroy them. And I think what we're seeing in Gaza, and what is so horrific about it, is that not only do we see the mass murder of tens of thousands of people now, but also of the destruction of the infrastructures that whoever remains would need to have in order to be able to sustain a life there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lale. So now we're moving to Dalia. So
yes, I wouldn't have thought of a better prelude, but anyway, so I think that people in their 40s, 50s, and older in this region have grown up convinced that infrastructure is the main prerogative of the state. It's kind of the natural monopoly. It's the state that has to provide these kinds of strategic infrastructure, strategic to life. And of course, it's unthinkable that the state would not provide infrastructure, and it's within its capacity. If a state does not have the traditional means to extend infrastructure and design them, then they will always have either to borrow or to do something about it. But in our brains or in our minds, the state provides the infrastructure. And this is where I want to start by unhinging this conviction. Infrastructures now are not provided by the state. In fact, the state's role, as I'm going to explain, has become the facilitator and also the entity that has to control the risks that investors might face when they put their monies into the infrastructure. And here, my fascination with infrastructure came actually from my work in India and Egypt, comparing the privatization of highways. Highways and transport infrastructure. And I think, as I mentioned in my abstract, I'm going to tackle the question of why is it that all of a sudden many countries in the global south, and particularly in the Middle East or the MENA region, are witnessing this huge resurgence of mega infrastructure projects that are primarily transport, whether we're talking about marine, like maritime transport, or even roadways, mega projects like in Cairo here, the monorail, and other. We have like 4,800 plus kilometers of new roadways and expanded existing roadways. So what is it that could explain? Especially that if we look carefully at the budgets, the state budgets, whether we're talking about Cairo, Sudan, or elsewhere, they are not enough. There's no enough money. There's no enough money. So where is this whole thing coming from? And here I argue that in order for us to understand this resurgence, we need to look at two forces, global forces, that came to converge. The first one was, of course, the post-financial crisis situation, when Basel III agreement regulating international bank performances made it clear that the banks have to channel their liquidity in countries that are lower in the financial and monetary hierarchy. And that the best thing to do would to channel this in the form of financial instruments for infrastructure projects. And I will not go into the details of how this nexus between finance and infrastructure came to wed. But I will just mention that post-Basel III, we also have the G20 establishing the global financial hub, the global infrastructure hub, that started spreading the narrative of infrastructure gap. And this gap is actually, for the layman or the layperson, it's that you are a country with deficient infrastructure. But in reality, it's actually the gap between the liquidity in the global north and the imperative to circulate this kind of finance or money through finance, and a gap of the geographic spread of these kinds of financial investments. So that's one, and of course I can elaborate in the Q&A about this issue. The other force that came to converge with this one was, in fact, the changes in the architecture of multinational or multilateral development organizations. So if we look carefully at how the World Bank, for instance, or the African Development Bank, or the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what happened to them in terms of their mandates, we will recognize that now these kinds of international organizations also have to get into the private financial markets. And both forces give credit to this unrelentless expanding narrative of infrastructure gap. And here I want to ask the question also, does these countries actually need these kinds of projects? Does these projects, or do these projects reflect a real demand on the ground? Not only considering that people might be interested in having these kinds of glamorous projects, but I mean in terms of the capacity of the households, the capacity of individuals to actually spend or even use these kinds of infrastructures, bearing in mind that if we look carefully at how the projects are financed and how who have the recourse, it's actually quite interesting that these projects, by virtue of their financial origin, they cannot lend themselves to public scrutiny or ifsah, disclosure. And not only that, but even the projects themselves, the state agencies that have initiated the financial instruments behind these projects are not entitled to disclose their books. And also they cannot be recourse. I mean, nobody can actually sue them or even ask them to disclose their financials because of the design of the project financing system of these projects. Well, what I want to say is that in order for when these two forces converged, it's quite interesting that the third force that came, I wouldn't say unexpected, but was unintended, is the fact that these two forces come very handy to the regimes of many of the MENA countries, especially regimes that are deficient in legitimacy, or those like in Egypt, for instance, with the will to prove that we are capable of handling turbulent times. So these two forces give the regime the opportunity to build big and quick. So to prove, it's another way of saying, to prove to their constituencies, to their citizens, that we are strong, able to deliver these kinds of humongous infrastructure in short time. But what I want to say is that when this happens, we're actually falling into instability. It's not only instability of the regime, but it's instability in the financial component itself. Because of the nature of these kinds of financial instruments, they have lots of dissonances, different maturity periods, different risk parameters, different even interest risk or revenue risk or loss. And they have to be, okay, 1 minute, yes. And they also have to have tremendous portfolio, a portfolio that is diverse. So it's not only one project, but different projects that have to come under the same investment portfolio in order to allow the buyers, who are mostly institutional buyers like EBRD or Deutsche Bank, to invest. And the idea also is that it places, because of the nature of these financial instruments, governments have to pay the profit immediately. It's not a long-term investment or a long-term like in traditional banking systems. So what happens is that we find many regimes are doing the Ponzi scheme-like investment. So they would sell or issue certain types of financial instruments here, issue another there, try to pay the immediate profit across the two investors, and so on and so forth. But the one thing that also the governments or the regimes have to do is what happens internally. They have to also transform the agencies, the state agencies, the ones that used to be the natural monopoly over infrastructure. So we have institutions or agencies that are no longer service providers. They are actually financial investors. Like, for instance, in the last study that we made, the time is over. Okay, we can discuss this in the Q&A. Okay.
Thank you, Dalia, very much. So now moving to Ekin.
Thank you. And I would like to start thanking APSN and Sadej, particularly May, Pascal, and Ahmed for inviting me to take part in this timely, important conversation. And my reflections today will be on environmental politics of infrastructure. And I'm an anthropologist studying large hydroenergy dams in Turkey, focusing on analyzing the centrality of infrastructure and ecology, their interplay to the making of state power, expert politics, and rural futures. In contrast to their technopolitical representation as infrastructures that tame and conquer nature, dams are actually environmentally entangled infrastructures. Hence, their design, construction, and maintenance are always shaped by non-human forces as well as human practices. One of the pieces that has shown this was Timothy Mitchell's well-known piece, of course, Can the Mosquito Speak? That traced the interconnections between the Aswan Dam, war, disease, and chemicals, showcasing the need to bring in non-humans into our analysis, not actually as autonomous forces independent of social and political processes, but as co-constituents. In Turkey, technical experts and state actors have long approached dams as more than technical infrastructures. So they recognize the environmental aspects of these infrastructures, and they more and more increasingly integrate nature restoration projects into dam building. And in that context, I specifically critically analyze the everyday practices of state engineers in controlling reservoir sedimentation through erosion control, and in salvaging and saving endemic and rare plants before they submerge under dam waters. And I ask, what kinds of politics are these environmental practices infrastructural for? In other words, what forms of political power and ecological life do they enable and facilitate? In a couple of minutes towards the end, I will come back to this question, but I also want to kind of situate my work within the larger infrastructural turn in MENA. So, and the new lenses these studies provide for understanding ecologies of and as infrastructure. If political underpinnings and implications of construction and everyday use of infrastructures in the region have been significant topics of study, their destruction and dismantling are other emerging topics, especially under conditions of war and violence. As Erika Weinthal and Jeannie Sowers show, protracted conflict and prolonged occupation in different contexts across the MENA target environmental infrastructures such as water, food, and energy, and result in a form of slow violence in which the adverse impacts of destruction accumulate over time. And Lale's talk has very well illuminated that as well. As we are talking today, in fact, the targeted destruction of environmental and health infrastructure in Gaza, Palestine, by the State of Israel continues as the key brutal pillar of ongoing genocidal violence, leading to the complete ruination of the material conditions of life. But the politics of infrastructure studies in the MENA region has also showed that our analysis should not and cannot stop at points of destruction and war. Among such new recent works, for example, are Munira Hayat's book, A Landscape of War, that reveals, quoting from her, the vitalizing more than human relations that persist and make life amidst returning seasons of devastation, end of quote. And in South Lebanon, for example, in her work, tobacco cultivation and goat herding constitute what she calls survival collectives, which are infrastructural to the sustenance of life amidst ruination. To understand similar resistant ecologies in Palestine, sociologist Manal Shakir develops the term ecosmooth, which explains ecological practices of steadfastness, aiming maintain attachment to land and fighting back against the settler colonial disruption of this attachment. So in doing so, these works propose moving beyond infrastructural ruins in the region by paying attention to everyday practices of making livable worlds. As my work shows, however, restoring life amidst ruination or in the aftermath of ruination is also a governmental practice, which is infrastructural to maintenance of power, hierarchies, and injustices. In making this point, I build upon existing scholarly works in the region, and to name a few, for example, historian Diana Davis showed the key role of environmental restoration discourses in the colonization of Africa. Geographer Iris Braverman her work illustrates how Israeli settler colonialism employs claims of greening the landscape while simultaneously destroying Palestinian ecologies. Also, in addition to these works, the claims of making livable future by state and corporate actors more recently materialized through the construction of renewable energy infrastructures in the Arab Gulf, as explored by Gökçe Günal's book, Spaceship in the Desert, or more region-wide initiatives of climate change mitigation, such as Middle East Green Initiative led by Saudi Arabia, that entails massive tree plantation schemes and green energy infrastructures. So drawing on these works, before concluding, let me come back to my own research and the question I posed in the beginning: what kinds of politics these environmental practices, their incorporation to dam building is infrastructural for, what kind of power and politics they enable and facilitate. I will briefly address this question by taking you to Çoruh Valley in northeastern Turkey, which is the borderlands with Georgia, where I conduct my fieldwork. And Çoruh Valley was once a deep valley with a Mediterranean microclimate shaped by fierce flow of the river through steep mountains. And now it has become a construction zone for 10 consecutive dams. In this valley, the botany professors and state foresters initiated Turkey's first project of salvaging endemic and rare plants before their inundation. So this project marked the first instance where resettlement and relocation caused by dams, typically focused on local communities and archaeological sites, have extended to encompass plant life, and was then followed by salvaging of also local fruit trees and fertile soils to locations above the reservoir elevation. So in early 2000s, when the proposed large hydroenergy dams began in the valley, the implementers of these salvage projects became concerned about the anticipated negative impacts of the reservoirs. According to them, large dams were inevitable mega projects that would have unavoidable sacrifices, but they believed these sacrifices could be compensated by relocating endangered plant species to make them thrive in the aftermath of ruination. So environmental destruction, therefore, was no more rendered invisible nor denied by the proponents of proliferating mega infrastructure projects that Dalia has also talked about. Instead, these actors acted upon destruction with the aim of not preventing it, but redeeming as much nature as possible out of the process of what they cast as inevitable destruction. In the Çorum Valley, the act of making ecological life possible in the aftermath of submergence is therefore a governmental endeavor that creates what I term movable nature. As state-sanctioned experts and local government representatives, the salvagers presented themselves as the only actors who could have the power, authority, knowledge, and resources to mitigate damage and allow the continuation of life in the valley by making nature into a movable asset. The salvage project, in addition to producing categories such as endangered plants deemed worthy of rescue, enacted the power of salvagers through performances of expert authority and served as a governmental tool to legitimize further destructive projects. Once established as a mitigation strategy, the practice of rendering nature movable circulates across various infrastructure and extraction projects, facilitating the expansion of the very environmental damage it claims to mitigate. For example, one example of that instance of facilitation of further damage was in 2015, when after the longest lasting anti-mining resistance in the Çorum Valley, the administrative court annulled the favorable environmental impact assessment report for the copper mine, and due to its negative impacts. And what happened afterwards, after that annulment, subsequently the company obtained a revised environmental impact report with a new proposal to relocate the endemic plants, hence ensuring the approval by the court, and the mine is now under operation. Therefore, what I show in my work is that the circulation of environmental salvage practices creates the conditions for further ruination caused by proliferating infrastructure and extraction projects, not despite, but because of mitigation efforts. And I will stop here, looking forward to the discussion in Q&A.
Thank you, Akin, very much. So we have already a few questions from the audience, and I see Lale has already made a head start on answering some of them. So I think the first question, why there is a clear bias with the other humanitarian issues versus the Gaza or the Palestinian plight? I think that's the first question. The second question, if we transpose this logic to what's happening in Egypt, how can we understand the systematic building of roads and bridges? Is there a hidden logic, rationality behind these infrastructure? So I think I would suggest that we start with these two questions and then we can move on to the next. So let me start by Dalia. You can select any of the questions to comment on.
Talk about the question, if you wouldn't mind just repeating the second question very quickly.
Yeah. If we transpose this logic to what's happening in Egypt,
yep,
how can we understand the systematic building of roads and bridges? Is there a hidden logic / rationality behind these infrastructures?
Yeah. there is a study that I've been doing for the past three years, actually, on infrastructure. And there is, I mean, the outcome of this is coming up in February in a book by Bristol University Press on the emergence of what is called the land infrastructure finance nexus. In fact, the resurgence of these kinds of roadways, not to mention there is a historic link between dictatorships and roads. It has to do with many things, including the so-called national strategic security. But that is a logic that has been overstudied. What my concern is that we're not receiving direct loans as much as we used to receive earlier. The traditional bank lending, whether we're talking about direct from since the World Bank or other kinds of like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, these kinds of traditional lending are not anymore the same as they used to be in the 1990s. These kinds of international organizations or international finance organizations are preferring to the government or the regime, the state itself, to reorganize and shift its own agencies and be able to issue financial instruments with credit rating. And in order for a government to have high credit rating, they have to undergo a lot of transformations and to prove also that they can deliver at least the early stages of these kinds of projects. So the logic, yes, it is mostly financial logic. The logic of financial instruments like bonds, like also the emergence of Sandu al-Siyadi, the sovereign fund, and the quasi-sovereign funds, زي تحيا مصر in Egypt or other such quasi-sanadiq, quasi-funds. So we haven't heard of these as much in the 1960s or 70s or 80s or even under Mubarak, even though under Mubarak's regime, the infrastructure for this, the legal changes, has been underway since 2003, and the new laws to re-regulate the Central Bank of Egypt and to allow for the emergence of non-banking financial institutions, it started then. But after the uprising and after so many turbulent times, it was the opportune moment to allow these kinds of infrastructure, I mean, the basics, the pillars, to allow for this kind of land infrastructure finance. What concerns me is that this...
Dalia, I'm sorry, we have to go on because our time is very limited.
Yeah, I will just wrap up. I just wrap up on one sentence that this land infrastructure finance has three dissonances: urban, temporal, and also scalar dissonances within the state itself, so it might not make it stable. That's it.
Thank you very much. Lale, I think you can answer the first question, why there is a clear bias with the other humanitarian issues versus the Gaza or the Palestinian.
I just want to briefly reiterate what I've written, which I don't want to shift it to why is it that Israel is so awful to Gaza and why is there so much complicity. But rather, I want to say that there is an entire cycle of production of infrastructure, which is between the war makers and those that provide aid. And it ends up being that, you know, there's, I mean, people in Palestine joke about this in a kind of a gallows humor, that there are schools that are built with the money from the EU and then they're destroyed with the money from the US. And it just keeps going and going. And of course, part of the reason for the continuation of that is just the fact that this is the aid industry that works, international aid industry that works hand in hand with the military industrial complex. And I think that the circuits of financing, the circuits of construction, the construction companies indeed that get engaged, actually a lot of the times end up being very overlapping. And so I think that partially explains why Gaza is a particular target of this.
Thank you very much. Ekin, I do have a question for you. It's very fascinating to learn a little bit about these processes of environmental destruction. And I do wonder to what extent the MENA region has particular aspects or dynamics when it comes to this kind of destruction, or whether we see this as a global phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's of course, global phenomenon. Like, I have to say that we have to also de-exceptionalize the Middle East and North Africa in that sense. It's a very much, it's a process interconnected globally. So it's not something that is kind of exceptionally happening in the MENA region. But I think the forms it is taking, the very particular forms, especially when it comes to their results in terms of political regimes and power dynamics, so on and so forth, it has its own, the region has its own particularities as well. So, for example, when it comes to Turkey, we see that, you know, in that particular context, the dam building and the kind of authoritarian populist power emerges really out of the intersection of building dams, so kind of like claiming the state as still, these are state projects, by the way, large dams, when it comes to the dams that I study particularly. So kind of the authoritarian political power emerges like through the claims of, you know, both taming the river through dams, but combining it with efforts of mitigating the risks and environmental damages. So now there is more and more, again, the authoritarian populist power making itself through claims that it is the authority which is able, if there is going to be one authority that is going to be able to mitigate any damage, it will be the AKP government and its local branches of municipalities, so on and so forth. So I think there are particularities coming out of the political context of the MENA region in terms of the power dynamics and politics. But of course, these are highly global, as you know, environmental crises has shown us throughout the world. It's a global phenomena, taking particular shapes in the global south and in the MENA.
Thank you, Ekin, very much. So we have a couple of questions about finance, the foreign aid assistance, what's the impact on the infrastructure? Also, to what extent these infrastructural project always comes with embezzlement, corruption, and various other problems that come with the financing. So Dalia, would you like to answer some of these questions?
Yeah, regarding the foreign aid, we have to also distinguish between two types of aid. The aid that we used to have in the 1980s and 90s is still going on, but it has shifted completely into, and it has never been a direct monetary outlays. It has always come in the form of institutional capacity building. And so far we have seen what the USAID and the JICA and the GIZ, they have even focused now on helping the government agencies to refocus on infrastructure provision and management under the so-called participatory planning and stuff like that. So they don't actually give us money in that sense. The other form, which is really very tied to the kind of mega projects that we see, has to do with the preferences of the international financial organizations, not to give money, but to support the infrastructure or the capacities of the state to have finances, to finance these kinds of infrastructure. So for instance, the establishment of sovereign wealth funds, quasi-sovereign wealth funds. This is what the IMF, the World Bank, and IFC are interested in establishing in many countries of the global south. And these are not, they don't receive direct money. They actually receive money to help them issue financial instruments that allow these kinds of projects to happen. So that's this distinction needs to be clearly. What was the second question, very quickly?
I will come back if
okay.
Please. Yeah, thank you, Dalia, very much. Lale, we've got a couple of questions. One on China's BRI's efforts having somehow more foot in the region at the moment, and to what extent this is gonna cause likely conflict with the US. There's also another question on how your approach would apply or not apply to countries like Iran, where there are international sanctions?
Great question. Hi, Walid, who's asking the question about the BRI. So what's really interesting about the BRI is that in some ways, as the Chinese government has actually spread its kind of largesse and infrastructure construction through the Western Indian Ocean, one of the things that it has done is that it has been very careful about staying away from the Arabian Peninsula, at least, not necessarily the rest of the Western Indian Ocean, but from the Arabian Peninsula. And in part, that has been because of the relationships that the Chinese government very closely and intimately maintains with, for example, with Dubai. And it processes a lot of its infrastructure investments in East Africa, as well as the security processes, as well as the finance, through Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi for the security, Dubai for the finance in the Dubai International Finance Center. And I think the fact that the Dubai International Finance Center is actually shifting, for example, its arbitral processes from London to Dubai itself, and so actually bringing everything over further to the east, actually also benefits China in some ways, because I think what it does is it removes those sorts of disputes out of Western courts and into courts in Dubai. So there's really interesting relations going on there. Now, what's really interesting also is in the last few months, the US has tried to sort of get Adani, the Modi government's crony capitalists that manage ports and other kinds of transport infrastructures, to actually come and compete with the Chinese in the Western Indian Ocean. And there was just a couple of days ago, or maybe a week ago, there was an announcement of Adani going into a port in Sri Lanka. But I think that at the moment, the Chinese have a very long and well-established set of relations. And I think it will take a little bit of, it will take quite a lot of work, actually, before we see Adani catch up with the Chinese in the Western Indian Ocean in that way. And then as to Iran and the question of sanctions, again, China and India are very interesting instances of financing, skirting around Western sanctions. India invested in the Chabahar ports, for example, in southern Iran, and the port infrastructures there, which are intended to sort of compete with the ports in Baluchistan that China is funding. And of course, we also say that the Chinese are, for example, talking about, they have been very involved in the construction of the metro in Iran, so internal transport infrastructures, but there's also talk of high-speed rail and other kinds of areas which the Chinese have the technology that they could potentially transfer. So although the sanctions limits the access of the Iranians to these European and North American infrastructure, finance, and technologies, that is not necessarily true with the technologies and finance coming from the East.
Thank you, Lale, very much. Ekin, I would just go to the last question. Can you say a few sentences on the imbrication of care and control in infrastructure? It seems like tools of governance are inherently tools of both caring for a population, but also through modes of control. So this is already a very, very interesting aspect, and it would be great to have some of your insights.
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. It's actually care as a form of control as well. So it's not like I won't approach it as care on the one hand and control on the other, but it's a form of governmental care as a way of controlling populations, both human and non-human populations in that sense, because in this, so it's not care from bottom up, where a lot of care studies at the moment is about like how people, ordinary people on the ground or social movements, or feminist relationships, that is all about like caring each other and maintenance, so on and so forth. But I think infrastructure studies has contributed to that, to those studies of care, by showing that maintenance and care are also state and corporate practices, like elite practices, developed and implemented to not only kind of to care for each other, but like to also as a form of power and control and governmentality. I think infrastructure studies has done a lot of good work in kind of de-romanticizing care and maintenance. In that sense, we are seeing it a lot in the Çoruh Valley. As I said, the destruction and ruination has become a rhetoric, a discourse in the hands of the government, both local and central government, as a process which they care about, and they try to compensate through practices of all sorts of salvaging and resettling life in the valley. And through those practices or claims of care and maintaining a future life in the valley in the aftermath of submergence, they mobilize their own power. And really, the local government, for example, is from the ruling party in the valley and from the ruling AKP party. And they were in their efforts of caring for the annihilation of the valley, they very much mobilized the fact that they have the links to the central governing party, and they are the ones who can mobilize their political interconnections and relationships to bring in the funds and resources to compensate for the annihilation. And those are the dynamics of care as governmental control in the valley.
Thank you. So back to Dalia. So I think one of the main issues now and the hot topics are the scandals around corruption, embezzlement when it comes to the politics of infrastructure. And if you could also elaborate a little bit, I mean, you've talked a lot about the finance, and how does that affect the everyday life of people in the region?
Yes. In fact, I want to say one thing, that with the shift from direct loans, because in a direct loan, the state, the borrower, knows exactly when she or he will repay and the interests. So they can easily calibrate their own budgets. But under financing, not monetary outlays, they have to juggle between so many different instruments with different maturity periods, with different immediate interest to be paid, things like that. This transforms the notion of al-dawla, the state, from the state to provide its own citizens and the economy with infrastructure, to de-risking the projects. And this is a very important shift in understanding statehood under the financial infrastructure nexus. Why? Because for the state, number one, it has to provide land. These are sunk in capital. Infrastructures are something that will stay in the ground, in the land. So they have to secure land. And this explains a lot of why a state like Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, by the way, for that matter as well, the demolitions and the removal of entire neighborhoods has to happen because they have to get land to secure, whether it's collateralized or not collateralized, they have to secure the land for the infrastructure. The second thing is, there's also a logic behind the global north having excess technologies. So they have also to get these technologies out. So we sometimes get infrastructure projects that are old and defunct, that a place like Netherlands will never do it. So, but it has to be exported somewhere. We will not throw it in the sea. The third thing that we need to understand also is that part of the de-risking function of the state is to have a very strong command and control over its people, over dissent, over democratic institutions, because otherwise they will not be able to maintain the creditworthiness. The Standards and Poor might reduce the credit rating of Egypt, or if Sudan or Saudi Arabia, in whatever, in a split second. So they have to maintain both a tight grip, command and control. Two, they have to also de-risk by providing land. Whether, by the way, like in Egypt, it's taken under the program of Masr Khalam al-Ashwaiyat, Egypt free from slums. That's very good. It sells. People will never say no to the demolitions and stuff like that. And the last thing I wanted to say is, no, actually, it's before the last, the corruption issue. In fact, there is no corruption here. And this is under investigation, but I'm going to say it as my hypothesis. In fact, corruption reduces. Why? Because most of these transactions are non-disclosure agreements. The public does not have the right. They're not stakeholders. It's the credit rating, it's the EBRD or the financial institutions that will buy. It's the institutions, the Central Bank of Egypt and the consortium of banks who will issue. It's the guarantor who is, in this case, has to be a very solid guarantor, like, say, for instance, in Egypt, the Ministry of Defense. So that is an important dimension. The last links to what Eken have mentioned of ruins. Many of the projects that are undertaken, of the infrastructure projects, are sometimes incomplete, and they cause a lot of urban dissonances. They are the future ruins, the ruins of the 21st century. We don't know whether they will be completed or not. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia, very much for these very, very detailed insights. I think I've got a question for our panelists, just to conclude this very lively discussion. I think I would like each of you to reflect a little bit about where the study of infrastructure is going now in the region. What are the gaps? What are the hot topics that many of the early career scholars would like to look further when they study the politics of infrastructure in the region? So, Lale, would you like to go first?
I mean, from my vantage point, one of the things that I see is there has always been quite a lot of interest in urban infrastructures in the Middle East, and some of the best research that has happened has focused really on these kinds of urban infrastructures. And they're incredibly inspiring works because they really do give you a sense of the ways in which our discipline and our area are in conversation with other areas and other disciplines. So I think that's what's really exciting, and it's something that keeps going. And of course, the ongoing destruction of our cities, what Dalia has been talking about, provides an occasion to study this stuff into the future. In my own time researching transport infrastructures, I've seen a lot more interest also in those kinds of large-scale, capital-intensive transportation and telecommunication infrastructures. And I think there's actually quite a lot of room left to research that, and especially for people who are doing creative work, in part because those kinds of large-scale infrastructures have enormous amount, and they're securitized everywhere, and researching them will be quite difficult to do. And so if you can manage to come up with creative ways that you can apply, not from a million miles away, but actually do really interesting ethnographic work, or do the kinds of work that Trevor Paglen has done in his book called Dark Spots on the Map, where he uses sort of absences as a way of as a methodological tool to figure out what was in that dark spot on the map. I think if we come up, if we have early career scholars who are interested in doing this research and looking for really interesting methodological ways to go on ahead and get behind the securitization, I think there's some really interesting areas of research to be done in the region, on particularly on extremely capital intensive forms of infrastructure building.
Thank you very much. Dalia?
Well, I'll take it from a very boring perspective, which is this perspective of what happens to local governments, because local governments and municipalities are the frontline bureaucrats, the ones that we as citizens refer to when the infrastructure doesn't work. And I must say that if we look carefully about how these mega projects are being financed and made possible, even by a handful of contractors. I mean, if you go into every country in the Middle East and you make a list of who are the contractors that are contracted for these kinds of mega projects, I'm sure in every country you might find them easy, like measurable, a small number. Coming back to the idea of local government, in fact, this system of mega infrastructure impoverishes municipal governments. because it puts them not as service providers or accountable or answerable to the citizens, but it forces them to channel revenues to the agencies that have become the mega project providers and financiers. They are not financing, but they are adjusting to be able to appeal to the financial investments to get their issuances running. So, and in Egypt, it's a very important case because of the emergence of so many, the so-called land value capture instruments. Most of these instruments are actually the mandates of the municipalities to collect the revenues from, and they do not even retain them to improve municipal infrastructure, but they have to channel them back to the Ministry of Finance or the other agencies that sanction this instrument. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia, very much. Ekin?
I echo both what Lale and Dalia have said so far as kind of points of further elaboration in the region. I can add a couple of more aspects. Maybe the one thing that comes to my mind, and I think there's much room for further study in the region, are the counter infrastructures or infrastructures of resistance. So in general, more like infrastructure studies from below, how people are not only engaging with infrastructures built by states or power or private companies, but infrastructures as they have been built and rebuilt and repurposed by ordinary people, especially as part of their political mobilization. There is a lot to explore, I think, there, and what's happening in Rojava, in northern Syria, Kurdistan, Palestinian struggle. We have all of these really strong political mobilizations ongoing, and then how they are building their own counter infrastructures, I think, is a very exciting point of, because especially in the region, infrastructures are very much, as Dalia had said, associated with state building, capital accumulation, colonialism. But I think moving beyond those questions would be amazing to look at infrastructures from below. And I think also South-South relationships of expertise and knowledge circulation, capital circulation is a very important point of study in the region. With China's involvement is of course a dimension, but also, of course, studying Turkey. I am very much interested in seeing how the Turkish expertise and private companies and their projects circulate in the region. I know that Gökçe Günel is now working on the export of Turkey's engineering expertise and projects into, for example, Africa. And more work, I think, can be done in terms of South-South relationships. And one thing would be what I consider as rural infrastructures. I think the region has a very good potential in the exploration of, in addition to urbanization, infrastructure has been associated highly and for a good reason with urbanization. But I think there's room for looking at rural infrastructures, especially in the region. There is a kind of, the rural life is a very, very lively part of political life in the region still. And I think there are emerging and very important studies on renewable infrastructures, more like green infrastructures in North Africa, solar panels, and in the Gulf, as well as Israel's new greening practices of renewable energy again, or desalination. And so those are, I think, the sites of exciting new research, I believe.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time. I would like to thank the panelists very much. I would like to thank the audience for very insightful questions that were definitely driving this lively discussion. Finally, I would like to remind our audience that there is a hybrid seminar series that will follow this event, organized by both APSN and SEDEJ, and it will be a hybrid seminar that will take place in Sadej in Cairo, but also on Zoom. And the series will be advertised soon, and it will be running between January and May. And so please keep an eye. And if you're not on our newsletter list of APSN and Sadej, please sign up. Thank you very much. And thank you for our panelists and for APSN and Sadej staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, APSN and Sadej, and thank you, Mai, for being such an amazing moderator. And really nice to meet you both, Dalia and Ekin.
Yes, actually, I'm happy to have met you, and thank you, APS.
Take care.
You so much.
Likewise, thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.